welcome back. I hope you've had a really enjoyable workshop or parallel session. There'll be more of that this afternoon. So continue tweeting. I think if anybody's got their phone out, don't put it back in your bag, get it out, tweet away, use the hashtag ResearchWales22 or @ResearchWales and we can retweet and all that business. So welcome to those people online as well, virtual world as well, together today with the people in the room. And we really hope that you're enjoying the conference too. And I really encourage online delegates to continue to use the chat function, Q&A function, and I'll try and bring some of that into the talk today. So I'm Nicola Williams, I'm National Director of Support and Delivery in Wales, and I'm joined by some friends and colleagues. They may not be friends at the end, depending on what they're about to say, but they are with me here. You can see their names up there, and I'll introduce them briefly, and then I'm just going to give a bit of an overview to connect to research delivery and what we need to do to improve it. But really, I'm keen to hear the perspectives of those, and I'm sure you are, the perspectives of those here today. So we're joined by Janet Messer, who's the Director of Approvals at the Health Research Authority, and by Andrew Carson-Stevens, who's a GP and our specialty lead for primary care research in Wales, by Andrea Longman, who's a lay research ethics committee member, who's going to tell us about her experience, and by Jen Harris, who's Director of Research Policy at the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industries, giving us the sponsor perspective and industry perspective, and by my colleague Lynne Grundy, who is one of the Associate Directors of R&D at Betsi, Cadwaladr, so really trying to facilitate research locally. So, first of all, I put this slide up in 2019, which was the last time you'll remember that we were all together. And isn't it amazing to be here together in the room, but also to be able to have people online. We've got 10 organisations delivering research in Wales, and we often talk about how do we improve research delivery in the context of those organisations. But they're complex, aren't they? They're systems in themselves. They've got processes and systems, and they have to then connect across organisations. And we often think about how we improve research delivery in that context. In 2019, I feel really strongly about this, that we also, though, need to look through the lens of the person that's on the receiving end of that research or that's impacted by it. So that's my daughter, that's your brother, that's your neighbour. So we've all got perhaps patients in mind who we think about, who we tried to get access to research for. And although I'm involved in the systems and processes and organisational stuff, I'm also in contact with individual patients who are struggling to get access to a cancer trial or to an M&D study, trying to make that easier. So we spend a lot of time improving systems and processes, but I want people to hold that lens of your next door neighbour or your mother or brother. And recognise, I guess, that we all need to be person-centred when we're having the conversations through the day. So we're focusing on the one, the patient, and not so much on the 10 organisations. In 2019, I argued that collaboration was probably the key to that our metrics and measures focused on competition and which organisation was recruiting the most. But actually, if we collaborated, that kind of gestalt approach of the whole is summer than the greater the parts, we could do a great deal. I argued that we needed to not just look at one in the context of the patient, but also from a One Wales angle. And those that were in the session with me earlier with Jane Goodwin talked about One Wales. We've done some great work around thinking about Wales as a single entity when it comes to research delivery. Doing things once where they can be done once, collaborating across boundaries, and thinking perhaps of just having one site for the whole of Wales, but delivering it right across a population. Of course, that expedited tremendously. Suddenly, our day job became delivering a programme of vaccine trials. And we did it at a programme level, so we had a programme oversight on an all-Wales basis. And we were able, as a result, to identify the recruiting locations that were best placed to deliver for individual studies. We had national remote services that supported that, but we were able to very quickly get involved in all of those trials that were happening across the UK. In parallel, we launched a UK vision for clinical research delivery. All 4 ministers across the UK launched this vision in March 21, so over a year ago. And it's linked very closely, of course, to the UK Life Sciences vision, but provides a framework for what we need to do to progress some of the system changes that support the patient and involvement in research. The next 3 years show a focus on these 5 themes, and you can see there people-centred research being at the heart of that. But also, as we heard just a moment ago, how do we sustain our research workforce for research delivery? How do we support their careers? How do we do things in a more streamlined way through the use of data and digital tools? And how do we embed research? Not necessarily everybody has to do it, but how do we embed it into the NHS? But also, how do we streamline and make it efficient? And I guess that's part of the focus of the session that the people on the stage will be asked to reflect on. How do we make it more streamlined and efficient to ensure that research gets to the person at the end in the quickest way? Now, having done a lot of coordination and research in a more One Wales way, we've obviously articulated that in a glossy way through our offer to industry. And we describe here probably some of the things that we're proud of having achieved through the last 2.5 years, bringing together really hard-working teams across the R&D offices in Wales to streamline study setup and study delivery. But that's the gloss. But it's complex, isn't it? Or at the very least, complicated. There's still 10 organisations. There's still a huge amount of process to go through to get a study set up. So we do kind of probably operate in the complicated zone, bit of complexity theory here. We know that there are some known unknowns. Sometimes it feels chaotic, but we kind of can see some of it. So I guess my challenge to the panel here is tell us, and to you, I guess, ask us, tell us, what are the practical doable things that we can do to make research a bit less complicated? So at least for the researcher, and certainly for the participant, it feels very ordered and simple. So we're going to hear from the panel on those different perspectives. The perspective, the reason why we're here, from the patient, from the person-centred approach, from the regulator and the sponsor and the person who's facilitating, and from the researcher perspective. So I'm going to turn first to ask Andrea, I guess, because that's what I've just said is the most important part of the puzzle, really. Tell us, Andrea, what prompted you to get involved in research?
Well, when I was 8 or 9, watching Tomorrow's World, I wanted to be an inventor. As I carried on through school, I realised that perhaps that wasn't the wisest career choice, so I wanted to become a scientist. And through various degrees and a PhD in plant biochemistry, I ended up working in a large arthritis research project, and it was quite complex, and we had a lot of help from HCRW or NISCA, as it was at the time, and to put this together. And I really felt actually I could give something back as well as doing the research. So that's how I volunteered to become part of an ethics committee.
What's been your experience? Tell us about some of the things, on that ethics committee that you've really had that lens of the person on the receiving end.
It's absolutely fascinating because my background is very much in quantitative research, and I've learned an awful lot about qualitative research. I've learned an awful lot about fields of medicine that I never even knew existed. I think as a layperson, my job there is to think, should I let my daughter do it? Would I say to my mother, yeah, go ahead and do that trial? My neighbour, my husband, for example. So I think that's, as a lay member, I tend to go for the participant-facing information first. I'll read the PIS, the consent form. Do I understand what they're asking from that? Does it reflect what it says in the protocol, for example?
Thinking about that patient information, I guess, and that's critical. We sort of really focused on that a little bit with some of the trials that we were thinking on a population basis. I'm looking to Andy around panoramic. You know, we were really conscious of how do you make this accessible. So what are some of the things that can really work well, Andrea, in your experience?
So certainly for complex clinical trials, having a sort of one-page information sheet. This is what the trial is. This is what we're going to ask you to do. This is how long you'll be involved. But please read the entire 21-page information sheet. Don't just make your decision based on this. And I think that's good. We see the good, the bad, and the ugly on an ethics committee, as you can imagine. We've seen some amazing PISs for people with learning disabilities, people with dementia, children. There's some brilliant ones and there's some terrible ones. I think there are people who will collate the good ones and share that information, which I think is brilliant, but equally researchers need to know that those facilities exist, that those libraries exist for them to draw on.
Yeah, I'm going to ask Janet to respond a little bit on patient information sheets in a second, because, or when you speak, Janet, because I think there's something really important. I remember sat in a clinic, somebody was talking through that patient information, but all of the I think it was about 40 pages, and you think, how is somebody, they were sort of, don't worry about all of that, which doesn't feel good practice, but neither does it to ignore it completely. So how are we tackling that from a regulatory point of view? I don't know, Janet, whether you want to say something about that. Yeah,
yes,
go.
I'll come in now on that. From Research Ethics Committee perspective, representing all the Research Ethics Committees in England, for which I'm responsible, but also the ones that we work closely with, particularly in Wales, but across the other nations as well. And we know full well that so many ethics committees feel this real sense of frustration that what they're presented with is just swathes of information that is being presented to participants. And they know full well that on the ground that translates into researchers, nurses, and other staff who are trying to explain that information in understandable ways to the patient in front of them, and you know, really having to do quite a big translation task. And it's that conversation that is actually the most important part of the process. So we've actually got a project that we're working on at the moment with colleagues across the UK to really look at what a good participant information process and consent process looks like. And what we hope by doing this as a specific project is that we can get further than the messages that we keep sending back saying, don't give them to us like this, because that doesn't seem to be working. Now, we know there are all sorts of vested interests in there. There are lawyers who are giving views, there are historic ways of working, and so on. So there's quite a lot to break down to change it. And I think, Nikki, that comes back to your point about the complicated and the complex. Research is complicated. Unpicking it to make it easier is quite complex. And those are the things that we're trying to grapple with.
Thanks. Andrea, I'm just going to come back to you, because actually on a UK vision, we're really interested in this person-centred. We talk about person-centred. What does that mean to you?
I think the best laid plans made with the best of intentions sometimes don't operationalise as we intend in the real world. And when I think about deliverability, we have these protocols, and the expectation is they will be delivered in real world settings, and sometimes there's a mismatch and a tension between those. So when I'm thinking of that, I'm thinking, can we find the right staff, professionals, to identify the right people, patients, public, service users, inclusively, to time and target. And as you rightfully said, unpicking all the various processes and structures to enable those three things to happen is complicated and complex. But we've realised from working at pace over the course of this pandemic that there is an awful lot of learning where we can optimise and improve processes and as a consequence get better outcomes for patients, for the public.
Thanks, Andy. I just want to check the sound is okay because we've got a bit of feedback. No, I think there's a few shaking heads. Can we sort? We've got a bit of feedback at the front, and I think people are struggling to hear. Are you struggling to hear? Yeah. There's a little bit of a delay. I don't know whether you can sort that out. Okay, we'll keep going. So, Janet, I'm going to come back to you now because actually you mentioned as well the complex and the complicated and how do we get some order in that. So it's not just about patient information sheets, obviously. What else are the regulators doing to support us?
Yes, so that whole notion of coordinating action between all the various parties in order to unpick the complicated is really important to us. So Nikki was showing that sort of, it was almost a Venn diagram of all the various elements of that strategy that she was describing from the report. And the Health Research Authority is particularly involved in the strands around people-centred research, around streamlining, and around data and digital. And actually that Venn diagram probably needs to be much more overlapping because those three are really intimately linked with each other. The ways in which we can help to unpick a great deal of what is difficult about doing research is by making better use of technology, better use of digital tools, but only if we do that in a people-centred way. If we really focus on what is it that matters to patients and the public when they participate in research and design research around that so that it is not only deliverable for the staff, but actually it's deliverable for the staff because it works for the patients. And taking that whole approach really helps you to unpick what matters most and then design around that. Now, that's not to say that that's easy because there's a great deal of vested interest, as I was saying earlier. There are lots and lots of different organisations, even in Wales, as you were describing. There are a number of organisations, and you multiply that across the UK, trying to get all of those parties to align to what we need to achieve and then to unpick the things that they need to do differently and embedding that change and moving people on. And in the room today, we've got a whole bunch of people who will all be working in slightly different ways, and sometimes that's quite right because you're doing different sorts of research in different types of settings, and so it needs to be different. But actually, when does it need to be the same? When does it need to be different? How do we align around common pathways when that makes sense? So some of the things that we've been talking about with colleagues across the UK is the notion of an ideal path. Not a single ideal path for everyone, but rather ideal paths for each research project. So that actually, as you embark upon a research project, that it is clear to you how you can go about that process from start to finish, that you can work your way through the process of linking with the researchers that you need to link with across the sites or even beyond the sites to find where participants are, to find out how they're going to need to participate, designing your study accordingly, getting it approved by the relevant parties through that process, knowing who you need to talk to and what information you need to provide to them at the right time. And having that really visible to people, because at the moment people really, really struggle with who they need to talk to about what information. We were hearing first thing this morning about some of the difficulties that people were worried about might come back post-COVID of grappling with studies. And absolutely, there are real difficulties, for example, around research with data. You've got to, depending on what you're doing, you may need to apply to the Confidentiality Advisory Group, and you may need to apply to an ethics committee, and you will also need to apply to the people from whom you're accessing data for permission to access the data. And the sequence in which you do that and the information that you provide to each of those parties, if you don't provide the right information to the right party in the right sequence, you will spend an inordinate amount of time trying to work out what they want, give them the right information, And actually, most of the delays that we see in the system are about people trying to answer the questions that they're getting fired at them, not the actual process of people approving. So actually giving people that clarity and helping people to understand what are all these steps for, do they serve a genuine purpose, and of course many of them do, then let's be clear about what the purpose is so that actually researchers can work out how to go through that pathway. So for example, to understand what an ethics committee is really looking at. How is that different from what the confidentiality advisory group is looking at? How is that different from what a data provider like NHS Digital or similar ones in trusts and so on? What is it they all need to know? And helping people to work through that pathway. And that's part of how you unpick this complicatedness in order to help people to do their research well and in people-centred ways and maximising the use of data and digital.
Thanks, Janet. And of course, some of these studies are obviously led outside of the UK. So, you know, Jen, thinking about it from an industry perspective, we've seen a huge impact, obviously, during COVID on commercial research and the views of industry on the UK's attractiveness to do research. So tell us about what is the view from industry at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think your one Wales can also almost be extended into then one UK, because I think when you're doing studies in 25 odd countries, you see the UK as a single destination. So as we're breaking that question down into two parts, I think one is that the pandemic has absolutely opened the eyes to global industry and sponsors around the world as to how they can design and deliver studies in a more pragmatic and person-centred manner. And I think that's really encouraging, and the UK were quite forthcoming in some of the regulatory flexibilities, and the programme approach that you mentioned at the start is absolutely something that was appreciated and recognised on a global stage during the pandemic. So there's a lot of interest in seeing how the UK translates those ways of working into business as usual, so to speak, in other areas. We are now starting to think about bringing that work into vaccines that aren't COVID vaccines, but what about therapeutic studies as well? So there's absolutely kind of a hawk eye on the UK at the moment, looking at what are you going to do next? Because you've done some good stuff. There's a lot of potential and opportunity. How are you taking that forward? It's been 2.5 years post-pandemic start. What are you doing? So there's that potential and opportunity. The challenge is that that opportunity and potential is against the backdrop of data that demonstrates that the UK is significantly lagging behind internationally in terms of its performance. Being a council researcher, I quite like a statistic, so bear with me whilst I rhyme some of these things off. During the pandemic, we saw over 40% of trusts pause studies, and a lot of those have struggled to get restarted again. We saw the NHS lose up to £450 million due to lack of commercial research during the pandemic period. And we've seen the UK drop to 10th globally in phase 3 when we were up at position 3, ranking 3 in 2018, 2019. So we've significantly fallen through the floor in a lot of these areas. It's not just due to the pandemic. We were seeing a decline before the pandemic. If you look at how the number of trials initiated in the UK have fallen over the past 4 years. Since 2017, the number of industry trials initiated in the UK has fallen by 41%. There's quite a lot of the portfolio gone. And if you look in Wales, that's starting to translate to patient access. We've seen the number of patients recruited into industry studies fall from around 800 down to about 600. So that is quite significant, and we're seeing that across the UK. So the view of the UK currently is one of hesitance, because they want to bring research here. They see us as a really critical research destination. They want to put us on their portfolio for multi-country studies, but we don't have the capacity we need to deliver research to time and target. Our set-up timelines can be up to 180 days just to set a study up. And if you look across to countries like Spain, where they are able to set up and do their costing contracting alongside their regulatory and ethics approval, they've got very tight timelines around their set-up times, around 60 days, and they have a lot of kind of royal decree / national legislative kind of frameworks that mean that there's very little wiggle room in the performance, which means that you have to kind of be quite steady and quite predictable and in line with what's expected. So that gives a strong sense of predictability in other countries. We have a very diverse population in the UK, which is a huge win, and we do have some pragmatic approaches. But if we can't translate that into reliable performance, we will lose studies out to other European countries, in particular Spain, and we're seeing places like Poland and Hungary, etc. So I think we need to kind of keep that in mind a bit when we're talking about global studies, because we are in a competitive international environment.
Mm. And I was going to ask you a little bit about that. We hear Spain mentioned quite a lot in terms of, that's the place to look for the sense of the speed and efficiency that we aspire to have. But it feels very complex, yet what you've described is this window of opportunity where we could launch into a space where we could truly transform and compete. What do you think that window looks like in terms of, if we dither around too long here, we're going to miss the opportunity. We're going to be, whatever we do then is too late.
Yeah, so I mean, in conversations that we're having with some of the global companies, they're already considering UK headcount cuts, and they're already saying no to studies at the point that the UK affiliate is then asked, do you want to do that study? So we need to remember that people are making decisions about where trials are placed in 18 months to 2 years' time, and our performance now is all that they've got to go off of. And if they haven't seen change over the past 2 years, they're going to assume that that's the trajectory and direction of travel going forward. So we have to make sure that our abilities and our performance metrics and things are really clear about what we're able to deliver. We need to be realistic about what we can deliver, and we need to be having those early conversations with sponsors about that future pipeline so that we can start anchoring and docking some of those studies in so that we can give those sponsors confidence that we can do that in the future.
So thanks, Jen. And I just wanted to just ask a final question into that, which is, we've heard a couple of times Wales is small and beautiful, and I would add, and of course it gives us potential opportunity by being small and agile. We've still got complex 10 organisations to manage, but nevertheless, how can we position ourselves perhaps to attract those global studies? What are the things that probably any country, any part of the UK needs to do that really sells the offer?
I think it's being really clear on your capacity, your capabilities and your expertise. I've had global sponsors say to me that they don't mind being told no, they would just like to know that the answer is no, not yes, and then it turns out to be a no. So again, it comes down to that predictability a little bit. And we know, for example, that there's a lot of strength in cell and gene therapies in Wales, for example. We've got a lot of strength in the basic science and in translational space. I was speaking to HCRW colleagues earlier around potential for a CRF and some of the early phase work. Sell that. They need to know what you're capable of delivering, and they want to work with high quality research. That doesn't mean it has to be coming out of the kind of usual Swansea Cardiffs of this world. They're keen to open their eyes to delivery in other areas of the country. So do bring in those perhaps slightly more naive sites and do upskill them and do try and offer what you're able to do.
It feels like deliverability is such a important thing, being honest about deliverability, and we talk about deliverability in studies, Andy, don't we? What does it tell us? What does that mean to you?
Well, I think we can't go back, Jen. The last 30 months or so have been a real opportunity for us to disrupt the usual paradigm of patients or service users come to us for research. We've broken that paradigm through the various opportunities we've had within the pandemic research portfolio, where we are thinking about models now of how do we take research to people's homes so they can participate, they can self-recruit, self-refer, and how do we make it as easy as possible to participate in research. And so we've had some brilliant, strong wins where Wales has been the top recruiter in major urgent public health studies over the last 30 months, as I say. When we think about Panoramic, this was a community-based platform trial for antivirals. That exactly was an opportunity for us to shine. From previous research studies in the community, we knew our primary care colleagues were absolutely swamped. So we thought, right, how do we grapple with the complexity in these processes? As I outlined earlier, can we get the right staff to recruit the right people inclusively to time and target? And when you get process obsessive, and that's my hobby horse, I'm afraid, as you know, inclusivity, looking at data, right, who's underrepresented for this particular disease or in relation to the wider population in Wales? Making that the norm, asking how do we make this as easy as possible for people to participate, you can hone your comms, your media messaging, so that within a short time frame you see the win in terms of recruitment and the outcomes. And it enables patients to participate in ways that previously we thought would be difficult to do. And it's appreciated, I think, by colleagues in practice that there is that support there. I think also, as I alluded to earlier, we have these best laid plans, and making them a reality is very hard. But we've learnt time and time again, taking the plans, the protocols to service users, to patients, to R&D staff in health boards, to Health and Care Research Wales, support and delivery staff, clinical trials units. Collectively, we can work out where the kinks are going to be in that delivery model. And early conversations at that conceptualization stage is key. But even once things have gone through the ethical process, it's about having courage to go, well, we didn't quite get that patient information sheet right. Or we're missing a trick here for this particular vulnerable group. We need to revise that. We need better work instructions to do this reliably for every patient so they can have a better experience. That's key. It's not a one-time thing. It evolves throughout the course of the delivery. And so I think if as a country we can show that we can achieve and deliver to time and target reliably each and every time, great. But also we need to show that we're up for working through delivering complex studies as well, and that we've got the right teams partnering across organisations to get that done.
Mm. And we have this conversation and debate about how do we embed research so that it becomes part of the ecosystem of everybody's job, but how do we also recognise there's a burden at the moment in every part of the system? And so what do you think some of those designs are going to look like in the future, Andy, where we're running alongside, but it's embedded at the same time? How can we have the two in parallel?
Yeah, certainly. So during the pandemic, we were thinking strategically in terms of where will the people be for this vaccination study. So ComFlu-Cov was the flu jab in one arm and your booster dose in the other. And within a matter of weeks, working with Public Health Wales, Cardiff and Vale University Health Board, we were able to come up with a plan. And we targeted a mass vaccination centre. We knew the footfall would be there. We recruited to time and target in 6 days. That's exactly how it should be. It was seamless. We utilised existing staff on the ground. Pharmacy staff showed will and contributed as well. Some of the nursing staff there participated and supported also. And that's what I hope we don't go back from, is that we're in it together. We're making research delivery part and parcel of what we do in the delivery of everyday healthcare. Then there's panoramic, I've alluded to that already, and that's a remote model. Yes, it's disruptive. It enabled patients to not have to leave their own home when they were really sick or worried about infecting others. And yet the earlier vaccine trials did require patients to come to base to be examined and all those things. So over the last 30 months, we've really upped our game in thinking about how do we enable this to be as convenient as possible. But when you've got remote models, yes, you are taking some of that activity away from community pharmacy or general practitioner surgeries where the hub and spoke type model of delivery would normally go on. That used to be the bread and butter of how we did it. But throughout the pandemic, we realised patients were falling through the cracks if we relied on those ways of working. And so they appreciated us coming up with disruptive, alternative, new ways of doing this. What's key, I think, though, going forward is that when we do things differently, we communicate to the front line what we're doing so that they can stay on board, that they can efficiently direct their patients to us as quickly as possible. And we've learned a lot about how we get that right as well in the last 2.5 years.
Thanks, Andy. So, Lynne, I'm going to ask you, because how do we get that traction locally? How do we get people within the organisation, busy clinicians, busy managers, busy directors of nursing to see research as a priority?
Yeah, so firstly, I just want to, I've been sitting here listening to the conversation, and I'd like to challenge some of the language we use in terms of seeing research as a burden. If we as a group of people who genuinely see the value of research can talk about it being a burden, how are we then going to help our colleagues to see the value of it? So I'm slightly uncomfortable when we're talking about it being a burden, I have to say. And also, I really, really want to put my rose-coloured glasses on now and say that actually our colleagues in clinical practice do see the value of research. However, I think we need to appreciate, and I'm sure we all do, but we need to appreciate the environment that we're all working in when we're trying to deliver research, and the operational teams who are working on an hour-to-hour, day-to-day basis, and just sometimes are subsumed by that. And I've been one of those people. It's really, really hard. So I think if the we in that question is how can we in the health boards as a research team help people to realise the value of the research. I think we constantly have to be out there talking about the impact it's had on patients. I think that's really, really powerful. So if we can talk about the research trial where actually a patient doesn't need to come in as an inpatient, so they're not taking bed days, we're delivering that treatment to them as an outpatient, that makes our operational managers' ears prick up, because that's something that they really, really want to hear. I have to say that managers, when I tell them what research is going on in our health board, are really, really pleased and say, wow. The execs are really pleased to receive research reports because they're positive in a challenging world. But I do think that we just constantly have to make sure that we, in that day-to-day busyness that everyone's subsumed by, we talk about research. And I'm with Jane really in terms of what does embedding research mean. Well, for me, it's about our patients and our population having the opportunity to take part in research, and our clinical teams being able to offer that research to our patients and our users. So it's a challenge, but we have to continue. In terms of at a Wales level, I think that nationally, people that have got the ear of ministers and the decision makers and the people that hold the budgets also have that same conversation. Yes, waiting lists are really important, targets are really important, the number of ambulances not outside EDs is really important, but actually research can make a difference to that. And when I think back to my own career, and we'll all be able to think of examples, the things I did as a student nurse and a student midwife, I just don't do now. Why don't I do them? Because research has changed our practice. And everyone realises that. So I think that people do recognise that. But we as people that need to try and facilitate that research at the clinical coalface, need to live the world of those people, understand the world of people that just have that day-to-day, minute-by-minute pressure, and constantly be able to sell the vision of research, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and we're going to do some national work around a bit of a framework for the NHS. That work's just starting, and I'm sure people will be asked to contribute to that. So if we were to do that framework, sounds like you've got it right there in Betsi. So what does good look like then? What do we need to see in that framework?
Gosh, I wish I knew, because then I'd write.
I'd
write. I think it's really important in that framework. We've talked about listening to patients and the public. I think it's really important that we listen to everyone involved in care. So yes, the patients and the public, but also the managers that have those constant pressures, and also the people that deliver research and the people that lead research. So I might have my own view of what good looks like, but I need to listen to everyone else's views as well, and that will make a good framework, because it will have engaged all the voices, not just mine, not just the patient, the public, not just the researchers, everyone's voice. So I haven't really answered, because I suppose the answer is I don't know, but we need to listen to everyone and make sure everyone's voice pulls together that framework.
Thank you. So it's time for questions. I've got a couple of questions from the online delegates. So in the room, we've got some mics. So think of the question that you wished I'd have been asking this great panel here. But while you have a think of your question, got a question for Jen, I suppose, about, we did pause a lot of research in the UK. We paused it because, there was this single focused objective, COVID research, get treatments very, very quickly. What happened in the other countries? Did they continue with the other portfolio? Is that what's contributing to the change in perhaps how they've been able to pick things up quickly?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag. So, obviously you have to remember that other countries do have different healthcare systems. They've got different ratios of public-private infrastructure usage, different portfolios as well. So it's, you're comparing kind of types of apples rather than the same kind of situation. But we certainly saw other countries have a similar type of kind of dip in the first phase of the pandemic. In the sense that healthcare systems were obviously overburdened and things needed to be put on pause. But then looking at some of our European counterparts, even Italy, which I'm sure we'll all remember in the early days of the pandemic, was devastated by the burden at the start. They recovered a bit quicker than we did and then kind of maintained that. So they never quite had the same, stop, go that we saw in the UK. They kind of recovered a bit and then kind of coasted there and have since kind of almost grown back. Spain, for example, has grown back to pre-pandemic levels of activity. So they've grown since the pandemic. Australia, on the other hand, we kind of think of them as the country that has been in perpetual lockdown for several years. But for some reason, they were able to keep all of their phase 1 units open. So a lot of early research went to Australia for the phase 1 trials. And now they have kind of maintained that, because once you move over somewhere and get used to a new place, you kind of maintain that engagement. So it's a real mixed bag, but we need to look at those kind of lessons learned. But it is completely linked to our healthcare system, and a lot of what we do is done in the NHS. So it's naturally going to be reliant on the NHS's status.
Yeah, and of course our healthcare system is shifting towards primary care. So Andy, where are we going to see research? What can we do to support research that's actually moving out as the pathways move out? Do you want to say a bit about that?
I think what's absolutely key is that the primary care workforce are really clear and know exactly how they can contribute in different ways to research and the research agenda. Throughout the last 30 months, there have been opportunities where we can take some research that previously would have been delivered by GP practices. And in doing that, we've had a greater reach. We've reached parts of Ceredigion and Anglesey that we wouldn't have previously. We've had breadth, geographical coverage, and we've been able to work on ensuring and maximising inclusivity in terms of ethnicity in ways that we've not done previously. So that's a real strength. I think the workforce is really up for delivering research within primary care, but it has to have the right resourcing and the right tools and know-how. And there's a capability gap here, and organisations like RCGP, for example, for general practitioners, they're really up in their game around this. They've just launched a big toolkit around research engagement. And I think what comes next for us is operationalising and showing frontline colleagues what it looks like to be research active, research savvy, so that the benefits for their patients are as clear as possible. And that one size does not fit all, I think is key here.
Yeah, that came from someone working in primary care in Wrexham, who's got another question, which I guess for Andrea and Janet really. How do we then kind of get really good engagement with the population around individual research studies or more broadly? I mean, you've seen some of our campaigns and things, but on a study level, what are the things that you've seen, Andrea, for example, that are really, really strong in terms of communicating with people about study opportunity even?
So I think facilitating involvement right from the start, so right from when a researcher is applying for grants, involving the public. You get the expert patient, and in some fields they're going to be the only people you can involve because they've had this condition for years, or their partner or child has had this condition and they know a lot about the subject. But you do tend to see the same people over and over again volunteering, and you know, there are people who are very happy to do that, but actually perhaps the people you want to engage are the people who don't volunteer very often. So I think the researchers need to look at that. And also, how do you help the hard to reach people become involved? So the elderly, the housebound, people in care homes, how do you reach out to them and get them involved in the planning stage of research, and also in taking part in the research, the studies themselves?
And you mentioned there, Anne, you mentioned the sort of, actually some studies, we're pretty sure who the records tell us who those people are likely to be from the inclusion-exclusion criteria. Janet, do you want to say something about that? You know, where digital comes in? Where are some of the digital solutions to some of that maybe?
Absolutely, and there's much greater opportunity to use the data that we hold in safe and secure ways in order to be able to identify where are the populations that might be relevant to a study. And indeed then, for example, the CPRD has mechanisms where actually you can work with them to adjust your inclusion and exclusion criteria, so that actually you're really thinking about who is it that needs to participate in this study in order to produce the results, you know, the information that you're trying to answer, and then design your criteria so that you're not inadvertently excluding certain parties just by virtue of assumptions that you're making. So I think there are opportunities for people to think more actively about, why have I got the inclusion and exclusion criteria that I'm assuming I need to have, and to challenge those, and then to actively think about, how do I reach those people? How do I find them? And meaningful patient and public involvement becomes really important here. It's not just about going to your existing PPI panel that you use for everything. They absolutely have a role, but they will not be able to tell you all of those things about different communities. And we do often talk about hard to reach, and actually the phrase that somebody in my team has used a number of times is not so much that they're hard to reach, but they are often ignored. And actually, if you think in that sort of way, then it challenges you to think about, actually, who are the people who need to be taking part in this research so that the results will be relevant to those people.
If I could just come in on that one. I think that point around how do we ensure that we're getting the right people involved and participating comes to a point that the other panellists have mentioned. If we're going to get real-world deliverability built into the study, we have to take it right back to the design point, and we need to make sure that the design is pragmatic enough and agile enough to do the things in the way that we want to do that. That needs to follow through to costing and contracting. If we're going to do things in different places, we have to be doing some of these setup processes differently. So it needs to be this kind of end-to-end consideration to real-world deliverability with the right people around the table to make sure that those decisions can be made. It's a bit easier to do that with single-country studies versus multi-country studies, but that's what we did during the pandemic, and that's what we need to take through into every other disease area now.
Thank you. Really important point. I'm going to just turn to the audience. Right, there's a question at the back there. Thanks, Toby. I've probably got time for one more question, if you could put your hand up.
Hello. There's a question for the panel and takes in a number of issues that they've raised, a number of challenges, in particular the framework that somebody was aspiring to, and the Spanish model and the design thing you mentioned just now. I wonder if any of the panel have considered the the role of capitalisation frameworks in the concept design when they deal with research projects. I bear the scars of appraising European projects for many, many years, and I can say with a shadow of doubt that the main issue that was missing was capitalisation framework. If you substitute the word knowledge for research, you can sell it a lot better to your colleagues. At some phase during your research project, I think you should, as it were, just hop over into it being a knowledge management exercise. And in that way, I found that projects look a lot better and a lot easier to inhabit your organisation. So I wonder, as I say, go back to my question, have you considered that sort of approach to your project design?
Thank you. Janet.
Thank you. I think that the framework that perhaps may resonate with some in the audience thinking about project and programme management methodology is a benefits-led approach. So if you're looking at the benefit, the outcome, the knowledge that you're trying to achieve at the end, and then work back from that, that helps you to get that mindset of what is the question I'm trying to answer, who is that question relevant to, and then you're thinking about the patient populations, as you said, Jen. Who are the patient populations, or indeed the public populations when you're talking about preventive medicine? And therefore, how do I design the study and run the study so that actually I will get an answer that is going to be relevant to that endpoint? So taking that benefits-led, that knowledge-led approach, and I think that also resonates with what you were saying, Lynne, about how that resonates then with the frontline care providers, because that's what they're interested in. It's the outcome of that research that they're interested in.
Yeah. Andy, then Lynne.
Thank you. It takes many hands to deliver some of these studies in the real world, and getting everybody on the same page is key. And really, when we think about the marketing approach, the communications that have to go out to staff, professionals, then patients, the public service users, really thinking and emphasising what's the existing knowledge gap is absolutely key for buy-in. In the panoramic trial, it was, we do not know whether these antivirals can keep you out of hospital. And that was a question that was relevant to frontline practitioners as well as patients and the public. And so that purchase was there as a consequence. And I think those best practices of working closely with service users, groups that can give us some of those answers to help articulate as clear as possible what the messaging needs to be to give the public, patients, the best chance of knowing and learning and thinking carefully and considering whether to participate is absolutely key and important work. That really it's the science of delivery that we need to hold on to the gains that we've achieved over these past couple of years and keep digging deeper to get it right, to optimise that.
Thanks. Lynne.
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge, and I think Kerry mentioned in the workshop the time lag. So often we all know the results take years sometimes for us to come out. So we might be recruiting patients. A, we're asking a question, so we don't know what the impact will be, and B, it may take many years. But if we can also take part in some of these bigger trials, Kieran mentioned the recovery trial, and the fact that because we could all come together and deliver that trial really quickly, we were able to articulate the benefits of that particular trial. I think if we can do more of that, that helps us with the here and now with some of the current studies and trials that we're doing, but also that we constantly look back, and we might have been involved in a trial 3 years ago, but we need to make sure that when the results come out and it does genuinely have an impact on patient care, that we're able to say, we took part in that, thank you to everyone that took part, and it was a real benefit. So I think we're probably poorer at articulating the impact of the work that we do, because sometimes it does take too long. So definitely we need to do more of those bigger multi-site global studies that generate the evidence quicker, but we also need to be able to look back and remind people of what we took part in, what we were involved in the past, and make sure that we're constantly talking about that, I think.
Thank you. Well, good place to stop, and I know we're overrunning a tiny little bit, so just join me in showing your appreciation to my great panel. They'll be here for the rest of the day. Thank you.